Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. For this talk, we're going to take a little journey from the context of the Santo Daime into the ever more popular environments of retreat centers, while continuing to explore the formative role of what Ido has just described as set and setting for the phenomenology and also the psychological outcomes of ceremonial plant medicine and psychedelic use. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the role of interpersonal experience during ceremony, focusing here on a concept that is called communitas, which has quite a history in social anthropology, but has so far been left mostly untouched in the psychological sciences. So you may have come across this term a couple of times in the course of this conference already, so I think it's a good time to give a bit of contextual and historical background where it actually comes from. Communitas was most extensively described by Victor and Edith Turner, two cultural anthropologists who lived for a number of years during the 1950s with Central African tribes to study the ritual process. And what they had observed was that during certain transitional states, during ritual, what can happen is a temporary suspension of the social structure of the community, which is necessary for a change in that structure to occur. And what that entails is that during these transitional stages, an equalization of all the members of the community can happen, which can elicit feelings of joy and harmony amongst each other. A good example for me to better understand this concept was thinking back to my last days of high school, where all the tests were written and all the classes were done, but we hadn't received the graduation yet. So you're in this transitional stage. You're not really a pupil anymore, but you're also not left into society with this new role. And what happened for me, at least during this period, was that all of a sudden my classmates, they weren't classmates anymore. They were just people. And all the teachers, they weren't really our teachers anymore. They were also just people. And this had an incredibly liberating joyful effect in a way, and I was able to make friends with people I had spent years with but never really talked to, because these kind of social groups and cliques and so on, they were kind of dissolved during this transitional stage. So this idea of this threshold, this transitional stage, originates in the work of Arnold van Gennep, a French ethnographer, who thought of the rite of passage as a threefold process, which is consisting of a first separation from a fixed point in social structure, transitioning into that liminal stage where communitas can arise, and then a reincorporation and reintegration into the social structure. So there's a dialectic cycle of structure, anti-structure, and structure again. And during this stage of liminality, of threshold, where social status is left behind, all kinds of weird things can happen. So for example, during our seasonal rite of passage, which is called Carnival, the powerful can all of a sudden be ridiculed, and the usually weak and marginalized, like the jester, can take over control of the city. And one nice example from the country where I come from Germany, is that on a certain day of the year, elderly women go out on the streets and they symbolically emasculate the politicians and businessmen by cutting off the neckties and displaying them publicly, like here. On this little display of loot, it says the town hall is occupied, kind of spelling out this reversal of power structure that can happen in these rites of passage. So these concepts of communitas and liminality have also been used to conceptualize the ayahuasca experience, especially in context of ayahuasca travel, which is in itself often resemblant to a pilgrimage or an initiation rite for many, in the sense that it encompasses this leaving of a set point and set culture, immersion into a more or less strenuous journey, and a radically different culture, usually followed by a flight back home and reincorporation into the culture that one came from. Although with a certain transformational experience marking some kind of change that happens during this process. Evgenia Fotiu spells this out in her dissertational work, where she writes, ayahuasca rituals are conceptualized as a liminal, transformative experience that contributes to the transformation of the self by providing the space to experience communitas and reflect. This is not a ritual that reproduces social order, rather the ingestion of a powerful hallucinogen provides the ideal instrument of critique of mainstream culture by challenging basic cultural assumptions about oneself and the world. So knowing that the subjective experience during ceremony or during psychedelic experiences is very important for its psychological outcomes. We were wondering if also communitas would be something that contributes to the effects of plant medicines. So we intended to test this by constructing a communitas questionnaire, operationalizing this construct, and distributed it through the help of ceremony facilitators and retreat owners who were so kind to distribute a set of questionnaires to their ceremony attendees. And we did this by first sending out a first questionnaire to the ceremony facilitators themselves, trying to assess like the local practices, followed by questionnaires up to 2 weeks before the ceremony to the participants, measuring some baseline variables, another questionnaire right before the experience, followed by the experience itself on the day after, measuring the actual subjective phenomenology and the subjective experience, set and setting, followed by a couple of endpoints, 1 day after the retreat, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 months, and 12 months after the retreat, while focus here on the 2 week and 4 weeks endpoints because currently we have the most data for these. So coming to the results, we had almost 500 people fill out the baseline questionnaire. 293 of those still filled out the post-experience questionnaire for those we know what happened during the ceremony, and about 200 stuck to the last 4-week endpoint that I'm going to present on. Big disclaimer now, because we're focusing here on the ceremonial setting rather than any particular substance, we didn't limit ourselves to ayahuasca. And indeed, most of the participants that we had in the study came from psilocybin, truffle, or mushroom retreats. So I'm sorry for infiltrating this ayahuasca conference with the psilocybin data here. What I'll do is I present the results from the analysis across substances and also mention if there's similarities or differences to the subset of about 100 ayahuasca drinkers that we've had in the study so far. So looking at the demographics, we have a predominantly white, highly educated sample. Mean age was 43, interestingly, despite very little experience with psychedelics or plant medicine. So for 40%, almost 40% of those that participated in the study, they actually documented their very first experience with plant medicines or psychedelics, which, yeah, I'm very grateful for. So Comunitas measured right after the ceremony itself. These are the questions that we used. The 5 first ones are adapted from previous research on liminality during night clubbing. The last 3 ones were added by my colleague Leah Roseman, and 2 of those also turned out to be the most endorsed ones. So here during the ceremony, I felt that social status became irrelevant, and during ceremony, I experienced all participants as equal based on basic shared humanity. Was something that many of those that participated in ceremony seemed to experience. All these items loaded on a single factor, so there was excellent internal consistency indicating that they're measuring a coherent construct. What we now wanted to do was see how this experience of communitas relates to other phenomenological dimensions that we already know about that are important during the psychedelic experience. And to tie communitas in with validated measures of collective experience, we used an identity fusion questionnaire, scale that you can see here, measuring a feeling of merging of identity with the group, and a perceived emotional synchrony scale, which assesses feelings of emotional attunement and shared emotion with the group during ceremony. For discriminant validity, we used a conventional set of questionnaires that are often used in this field, focusing on mystical, challenging visual experience, as well as ego dissolution and ego inflation. So this is a correlation matrix of all the just mentioned scales and subscales. In the top row you can see communitas, which correlates very highly with the other social measures, indicating good convergent validity here. There were also strong to medium to strong correlations with the visual and mystical aspects of the experience, showing that there's some relationship between the unitive experience of the mystical experience questionnaire and what we're measuring with communitas. The only proper discriminant validity was achieved with the challenging experience questionnaire, which didn't correlate at all with communitas. Some of the subscales, isolation and paranoia, were even negatively associated with it. So the higher your experience of communitas was during ceremony, the less you would experience paranoia and isolation. So it seems that this scale is actually measuring some coherent construct that has plausible relationships with other aspects of the plant medicine or psychedelic experience. Now the interesting question is, of course, how does this social component relate to psychological outcomes? And this is the increase that you could see in psychological well-being and in social connectedness from baseline to 2 weeks and 4 weeks after the experience. For well-being, this increase was sustained, whereas for social connectedness, it dropped to about half of the baseline levels between 2 and 4 weeks, suggesting that it seems that some of the connectedness that people seem to feel after participating in a retreat might not have been, or might have been carried over from the connectedness they felt to the other participants, rather than a social connectedness they feel to the environment that they re-emerge themselves in when coming home. Importantly, the increase between baseline and 2 weeks was associated with the extent of communitas experienced during ceremony, meaning the more you experience communitas, the steeper was your increase in well-being and in social connectedness between baseline and 2 weeks after the ceremony. Lastly, we also try to predict the experience of communitas based on set and setting variables. So for this, we included several sets of independent regressions on the intentions that people indicated to participate in ceremony, on psychological personality traits, the preparedness measured right before ceremony, as well as some concurrent variables, including the dose that was used, the substance that was used, the number of participants present during ceremony, as well as some elements of ritual design, such as the singing of Icarus, the presence of recorded music, of supportive individuals, and the active participation in activities like chanting, sharing circles, group meditation. So all the elements that you see here in green are positive predictors of the experience of communitas. The ones in red reduce the experience of communitas. I'm not going to go into this in detail. We then proceeded to create a unitive model to predict communitas by introducing all the factors that are significant here into a single regression model, and ended up with a final predictive model of communitas, which included the positive relationship that was built up to the ceremony between the participants and the facilitators, having spiritual intentions when coming to the retreat, as well as the presence of supportive individual, perceived threat, chanting of Icarus, and recorded music during the ceremony. So all these factors together explained about 40% of variance in these community scores. So to sum this up, we could see that communitas as an intersubjective experience is predictive of long-term psychological outcomes of ceremony, and in turn is predicted by set and setting elements that are unique to ceremonial designs. The implication of this is that there are certain non-reducible elements to the ceremonial setting which can have a measurable impact on psychological outcomes. Coming from a more clinical and laboratory perspective, this raises the question whether other modalities than the individual journey might be worth exploring for something like psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Group settings might be able to not only have inherent benefits for the psychological process, but also drastically lower the costs and increase accessibility of psychedelic treatments by reducing the individual cost per session. Lastly, I think the data kind of raises the question of sustainability. How can we help people to bring back the connectedness that they feel during a retreat into their home communities? And I don't think there's an easy answer for this question, but also already Victor Turner realized that the virtues of liminality cannot thrive in secrecy. These experiences need to be shared, they need to be articulated for actual change to be incorporated, and these processes to kind of be completed. So I think as long as there's a remaining stigmatization and remaining criminalization in the societies that people come home to, this will inherently be difficult. Which is why at this point I would like to give a massive thanks to ICEERS and everybody here who is working to change the public perception on these psychedelic and plant medicine technologies, as well as thank you to my wonderful friends and colleagues without whom this project wouldn't have been possible, our study participants, and of course retreat facilitators. Thank you.